He was a powerful man with a first-class ticket, yet at gate 17, they treated him like he didn't belong. That mistake ignited a revolution that would forever change the airline industry. Elliot Hayes adjusted the dark leather strap of his garment bag as he made his way through the bustling terminal of JFK Airport. The morning air still clung to a thin chill, but inside Terminal 4, it was all motion and noise. The hum of conversations, the rolling of suitcases, the occasional call over the loudspeakers. Elliot moved through it all with the steady ease of someone who had long mastered the art of travel. At 58, he had spent more mornings like this than he could count, flying from city to city, representing Atlas Air and closing deals that would shape the future of the company. Today was no different. He was headed to San Francisco, where he would deliver the keynote address at the Western Produce Sustainability Summit, a critical engagement that had been on his calendar for months. His appearance was impeccable. A tailored navy suit draped over his broad shoulders, a crisp white shirt that caught the terminal lights just right, polished brown Oxfords clicking softly on the tiles. His silver hair, neatly combed back, framed a face that carried the distinguished lines of a man who had built his career on competence and integrity. In his right hand, Elliot held a first-class boarding pass. In his left, the sleek garment bag contained his speech notes, a backup copy of his presentation, and a simple change of clothes. He preferred efficiency over flash. There were no flashy watches or loud designer labels on him. Only those who knew would recognize the subtle markers of success, the stitching on his lapels, the quiet confidence in his stride, the way he wore his wealth without needing to announce it. He was the kind of man who understood that real power spoke in a whisper, not a shout. As he approached Gate 17, Elliot could already sense something shift in the air. It was a feeling he had learned to recognize over the years, subtle but unmistakable. Conversations around him seemed to dim. He caught a security officer's eyes linger on him longer than necessary. A second glance, a whisper, to a colleague. Elliot kept walking, unwilling to let it rattle him. He was used to the occasional double take. People often underestimated him, assumed things about him based on surface impressions. It had been that way for most of his career. Still, the directness of what happened next caught even him slightly off guard. "Excuse me, sir," a voice called out. Officer Reynolds, a young man in a pressed uniform, stepped directly into Elliot's path. His tone was firm, not aggressive, but there was an edge to it that suggested suspicion. "May I see your boarding pass and ID, please?" Elliot stopped, offering a polite smile. Without a word, he handed over both documents. He knew better than to make a scene. Better to let the process play out, he thought. He had nothing to hide. Reynolds scrutinized the boarding pass, flipping it over unnecessarily, then stared at Elliot's ID as if trying to find a discrepancy. A minute passed, then 2. Passengers streamed around them, some glancing curiously at the unusual hold-up. "Is there a problem, officer?" Elliot asked, his voice calm. "Just a routine check," Reynolds replied, though his eyes told a different story. He spoke into his radio, and within moments, another officer appeared. Agent Porter, this time, older and clearly more senior. They conferred quietly, casting sidelong glances at Elliot. Porter took the documents from Reynolds, repeating the same slow examination. Elliot felt a familiar tightness in his chest. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was something older, deeper. He knew he fit a certain profile. Successful, polished, but in the eyes of some, Perhaps not the typical face they expected holding a first-class ticket, especially not on a critical business morning like this. Porter finally handed back the documents with a curt nod. "You're clear to proceed." Elliot received them silently. No apology, no explanation. Just the cold efficiency of men who had already moved on to scanning the next passenger. He tucked his boarding pass and ID back into his jacket pocket and continued toward the boarding gate. His steps were measured, his expression unreadable. Outwardly, he remained the picture of composure. Inwardly, though, he felt the old, familiar sting. No matter how much you accomplished, no matter how meticulously you built your reputation, there would always be moments like this, when you were reminded of how shallowly the world sometimes looked at you. But Elliot Hayes was not a man easily broken. As he boarded the plane, greeted by a smiling flight attendant who addressed him by name and led him to his seat in the first-class cabin, he allowed himself a small, private thought. This was not the end of the matter. Not because he craved revenge or demanded public apologies. No. Elliot had long learned that the most powerful changes did not come from loud confrontations. They came from quiet, unshakable action. As he settled into his seat, adjusting his briefcase beneath the seat in front of him, Elliot reflected on what lay ahead. In his garment bag, next to his speech notes, were confidential documents, details of a $48 million sustainability contract Atlas Air was about to sign. His signature alone could secure it or send it back into negotiation limbo. He thought about Officer Reynolds and Agent Porter, about how quickly they had judged, about how many other passengers, less composed, less privileged, might have been treated even worse. Elliot closed his eyes for a moment, gathering himself. There would be a time and place to address what had happened, and when he did, it would not just be for himself. It would be for everyone who deserved to move through the world without suspicion, tethered to their every step. The plane taxied onto the runway. Elliot leaned back in his seat, feeling the engines rumble to life beneath him. Above the clouds, beyond the pettiness and prejudice of the ground, lay a clearer sky, and Elliot Hayes intended to fly straight into it. The plane touched down smoothly in San Francisco, the late morning sun gleaming against the windows of the sleek aircraft. Elliot Hayes gathered his belongings with practiced ease, waiting patiently as the other first-class passengers stood and retrieved their luggage. There was no rush. He knew that the most important battles in life were often won in the spaces between moments, in patience, in foresight, in grace under pressure. The terminal at San Francisco International buzzed with the usual energy of arrivals and departures. Elliot stepped off the jet bridge, his garment bag slung easily over his shoulder, his briefcase in hand. He moved through the crowd with quiet purpose, blending into the flow of travelers until he reached the private transportation area where a black sedan waited for him. As the car pulled away from the terminal, Elliot sat back and opened his tablet. His inbox had already begun to fill with emails, logistics for the summit, final changes to the contract, notes from his executive assistant. But he wasn't ready to dive into work just yet. His mind kept returning to the events at JFK, the way Officer Reynolds had looked at him, the unnecessary radio call, the way Agent Porter had handled his documents with suspicion rather than professionalism. It wasn't the first time Elliot had been subjected to such treatment. And he knew it wouldn't be the last, but today it gnawed at him more than usual. Perhaps because of the significance of the day. Perhaps because of the knowledge he carried that Atlas Air's future business with Atlas-produced consortium worth $48 million, hinged partly on his presence and reputation at this very summit. He thought of the irony, how easily they had dismissed him, how narrowly they had viewed him, and how little they understood the cost of their assumptions. Elliot pulled up a file on his tablet. The new vendor, Diversity and Inclusion Guidelines Atlas Air, had quietly begun developing. He had been a champion of the initiative from the beginning, insisting that it wasn't enough to simply meet quotas or check boxes. Real inclusion required systemic change, training, accountability, a shift in mindset from the top down. The incident at JFK only reaffirmed for him how urgently such change was needed. The sedan pulled up in front of the Fairmont, an elegant hotel perched atop Nob Hill. Elliot checked in swiftly and made his way to his room, taking a moment to breathe in the view. The bay stretching out in the distance, sailboats scattered like white stars across the blue. He had a few hours before he was scheduled to speak. Enough time to gather his thoughts, enough time to decide how he would weave the morning's experience into the fabric of his keynote, because that was the kind of man Elliot Hayes was. He did not waste pain. He transformed it. He changed into a fresh suit, charcoal grey, with a subtle herringbone pattern, and reviewed his speech. The core message remained the same: sustainability, responsibility, innovation. But now he saw a way to add a new thread, a personal note. A reminder that true sustainability wasn't just about the environment, it was about people, about building systems that nurtured fairness and dignity at every level. Downstairs, the ballroom was already filling with attendees, executives from major agricultural companies, policymakers, non-profit leaders, journalists. The air buzzed with anticipation. When Elliot took the stage, he did so with the quiet confidence that came from years of experience. He spoke clearly, passionately, weaving together data and storytelling, painting a vision of a future where business and responsibility were not at odds, but inextricably linked. And near the end, he shared a story. He did not name the airport. He did not mention Officer Reynolds or Agent Porter. Instead, he spoke broadly, yet pointedly, about the unseen barriers that still existed, about how even those who appeared to have made it were not immune to being judged by appearances, about how real progress required vigilance, humility, and courage from individuals and institutions alike. The room grew still. You could hear the faint clink of a water glass being set down. Elliot let the moment hang there, not rushing to fill the silence. True sustainability, he said, his voice steady, is not just about how we treat the earth, it's about how we treat each other. The applause that followed was not the polite clapping of a business conference. It was deeper, more resonant. Elliot stepped down from the stage, knowing he had struck a chord. Afterward, as he mingled with attendees, several approached him to share their own experiences. Quiet conversations formed in the corners of the room, seeds of change planted in fertile ground. Later that evening, back in his hotel room, Elliot sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker against the darkening sky. He drafted an email to the CEO of Atlas Air, recounting his experience at JFK not in anger, but in hope. Hope that the company he had helped build could do better, that they could lead not just in profits, but in principle. He hit send, feeling a quiet satisfaction settle over him. Tomorrow, he would fly home. There would be other flights, other cities, other contracts. But this moment of truth would stay with him. Because sometimes change doesn't come with a roar. Sometimes it begins with a man in a tailored suit, standing silent and unshaken at a boarding gate, refusing to be diminished. The morning after the summit, Elliot Hayes awoke early, long before the first light crept across the San Francisco skyline. He sat quietly by the window of his hotel room, sipping black coffee, allowing himself a few moments of reflection. Despite the triumph of his keynote speech, the memory of the previous morning's encounter at JFK lingered. Not in a way that clouded his spirit, but as a steady, persistent reminder. There was still much work to be done. His phone buzzed with a new email notification. It was from Charles Whitman, the CEO of Atlas Air. Elliot opened it, reading the response to his detailed account of the incident at JFK. Whitman's message was succinct but genuine. An apology for the experience Elliot had endured, a commitment to investigating the matter thoroughly, and a promise to review and reform the company's customer service protocols, particularly regarding unconscious bias training. Elliot allowed himself a small smile. It was a beginning. He spent the next hour preparing for his flight home, meticulously packing his things as he reviewed his schedule for the coming weeks. Meetings, strategy sessions, board reviews. His life would resume its usual pace. Yet, something inside him had shifted. There was a sharper edge now, a deeper resolve to weave this mission, this call for dignity and fairness, more fully into his work. As he checked out of the Fairmont, the doorman tipped his cap respectfully. "Safe travels, Mr. Hayes," he said. "Thank you," Elliot replied warmly, appreciating the simple decency of the gesture. The ride to the airport was uneventful, and soon Elliot found himself back at San Francisco International, moving through security with the ease of long practice. This time, there were no suspicious glances, no radio calls, just the normal, mundane rituals of air travel. Boarding his flight, Elliot settled once again into a first-class seat, pulling out his tablet to review some documents. But his mind wandered. He thought about all the travelers who wouldn't have the buffer of status or influence to protect them if they were treated unfairly. He thought about young professionals, new immigrants, the elderly, all those who could be made to feel small in spaces that should have felt safe. It wasn't enough to fix one incident. Change had to ripple outward, touching every corner of the system. As the plane taxied down the runway, Elliot closed his eyes and let the roar of the engines fill his senses. He imagined a different kind of future, one where professionalism was measured not by appearance, but by character. One where dignity was a given, not a prize to be earned through credentials or connections. The flight was smooth, and Elliot spent most of it reviewing the new diversity and inclusion initiatives he intended to propose at the next board meeting. He drafted bullet points: mandatory bias training for all customer-facing staff, clear accountability structures, a new code of conduct that emphasized empathy and respect. But beyond policies and procedures, he knew the real challenge lay in shifting culture. That required stories, personal, powerful stories that could break through apathy and denial. His experience at JFK would be one of those stories, not told to shame or blame, but to illuminate, to inspire. When the plane landed at JFK, Elliot disembarked with the same composed grace he had carried through every step of his journey. Outside, the New York air was brisk, tinged with the scents of salt and exhaust. A car awaited him at the curb, and as he slid into the back seat, he reflected on the path ahead. He would not allow bitterness to root itself in him. He would not waste energy on anger. His mission was larger than a single slight. It was about building a legacy of fairness, one small, deliberate act at a time. As the city streets blurred past the windows, Elliot thought again of the young officer at JFK, the one who had looked at him and seen only a question mark instead of a man. He wondered who had trained him, who had failed him, and how many others like him moved through life unaware of the harm they caused with a glance, a tone, a hesitation. He would address it. Not with fury, but with clarity. Not with vengeance, but with vision. Back at his office, Elliot greeted his staff warmly. They, at least, knew him beyond surface impressions. They knew his integrity, his dedication, his unwavering belief that business could be a force for good. He spent the afternoon in meetings, reviewing quarterly reports, discussing marketing strategies, fielding questions from investors. But between the spreadsheets and projections, he found moments to speak about culture, about values, about the kind of company they were building, one where every individual was seen, respected, valued. Late in the day, after most of the office had emptied, Elliot sat alone in the conference room, the city lights winking against the glass walls. He drafted a memo to the executive leadership team, outlining the new initiatives he wanted to implement. Real leadership, he wrote, is not measured by profit margins or market share alone. It is measured by the way we treat the unseen, the unheard, the underestimated. He hit send, feeling the same quiet satisfaction he had felt after his keynote speech. It was not a dramatic moment. No headlines would announce it. No crowds would cheer it. But it was real. It mattered. Outside, the city pulsed with life. Millions of stories unfolding, colliding, weaving together. And somewhere among them, Elliot Hayes moved forward, steadfast and unshaken, carrying with him the quiet, revolutionary belief that dignity should never be a privilege. It should be a right. A few weeks after his return to New York, Elliot Hayes stood before the towering glass facade of Atlas Air's headquarters. The early spring air was crisp, carrying the scent of possibility. Today marked an important turning point. The company's leadership had agreed to a formal review of their customer service protocols and training systems, spurred in part by Elliot's experience and his subsequent advocacy. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with quiet energy. A meeting of this magnitude was rare, a full gathering of senior executives, department heads, and key stakeholders. Elliot straightened his tie, adjusted his cuffs, and entered the boardroom with a purposeful stride. The room itself was a study in understated power. Long mahogany table, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a screen displaying the agenda for the day. Conversations hushed as Elliot took his seat near the front. Charles Whitman, the CEO, nodded to him with a respectful smile. After the preliminary reports were reviewed, Charles stood and addressed the room. He spoke about the importance of customer experience, about how a single negative interaction could cost not just a sale, but a lifetime of trust. Then he gestured to Elliot. "I'd like to invite Elliot Hayes to share some thoughts," Charles said. Elliot rose, feeling the weight of the moment. He wasn't here to assign blame, he was here to open eyes. "Thank you, Charles," Elliot began, his voice steady. "I want to share a story, one that might seem small on the surface, but carries deep implications." He recounted his experience at JFK, the unnecessary scrutiny, the silent judgment, the casual erosion of dignity. He spoke plainly, without embellishment, letting the facts speak for themselves. "I was fortunate," he said. "I had status, influence, and the resources to address the situation. But many travelers do not. Many are left feeling powerless, invisible, diminished." The room was silent. Executives shifted in their seats, some avoiding his gaze, others leaning forward, intent. "If we are truly committed to excellence," Elliot continued, "it cannot stop at service quality or operational efficiency. It must extend to how we see and treat every individual who walks through our doors." He outlined specific proposals: mandatory unconscious bias training for all frontline staff, the creation of a customer advocacy department, anonymous reporting channels for passengers who experienced mistreatment, and a review of hiring practices to ensure greater diversity at all levels. When he finished, there was a beat of silence, then a ripple of thoughtful nods. Charles stood again. "Thank you, Elliot. Your perspective is invaluable." Discussions ensued. Questions were asked. Some executives raised concerns about cost, about implementation timelines. Elliot answered each one with patience and precision, drawing from studies that showed how companies with strong cultures of inclusion consistently outperformed their peers. By the end of the meeting, a consensus had formed. Atlas Air would move forward with the reforms, not as a reactive gesture, but as a proactive commitment to building a better company. Later, as Elliot rode the elevator down to the lobby, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Change, real change, was rarely explosive. It was slow, deliberate, often invisible, until one day it simply became the new normal. He stepped out into the sunlight, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. The city roared around him, taxis honking, pedestrians weaving through crosswalks, the distant wail of a siren. Life, in all its chaotic beauty. He decided to walk back to his apartment. It was a few miles, but he welcomed the time to think. As he moved through the crowded sidewalks, he observed the faces around him. So many stories, so many lives intersecting. He thought about the small kindnesses that could change a person's day, the small indignities that could scar it. Halfway home, he stopped at a coffee shop he frequented. The barista, a young woman with vibrant purple hair, greeted him with a cheerful smile. "Morning, Mr. Hayes. Usual?" "Yes, thank you," Elliot replied, smiling. As he waited for his order, he watched her interact with other customers. Kind, patient, attentive. He thought about how culture wasn't built in boardrooms alone. It lived in these moments, in these human exchanges. Coffee in hand, he continued his walk, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Change was coming to Atlas Air. Policies would shift. Training programs would roll out. Awareness would grow. It would take time. There would be resistance, missteps, learning curves. But the seed had been planted. And Elliot Hayes, with his quiet resilience and unwavering belief in the dignity of every person, would nurture it. He thought again of that morning at JFK, the sting of suspicion, the choice to respond with grace instead of anger. It had not been in vain. As he turned onto his street, the sun broke fully through the clouds, bathing the city in golden light. Elliot lifted his face to it, smiling. The journey was far from over, but it was well begun. Spring turned into summer, and with it came a season of transformation for Atlas Air. Under Elliot Hayes's quiet but persistent influence, the company launched a series of internal campaigns aimed at reshaping its culture from the inside out. New training programs were implemented, hiring practices were audited, and a customer advocacy office was established to give passengers a real voice. Elliot watched these developments with cautious optimism. He knew change was fragile in its early stages, like a young sapling needing protection from harsh winds. One humid afternoon, Elliot attended a training session for new employees at Atlas Air's operations center. He had insisted on being involved directly, not as a figurehead, but as an active participant. He wanted to see with his own eyes how the seeds he had planted were beginning to take root. The training room was bright and modern, with posters on the walls bearing slogans like "Respect starts with recognition" and "Every passenger, every story." Elliot sat unobtrusively at the back as the instructor, a young woman named Claire, led the session. She spoke passionately about empathy, about understanding the hidden struggles passengers might carry. She shared stories of veterans traveling to reunite with families, immigrants seeking new beginnings, business travelers like Elliot himself carrying the weight of high-stakes meetings. At one point, Claire introduced a role-playing exercise. Trainees were asked to handle simulated passenger interactions, some routine, some challenging. Elliot watched closely, noting the sincerity in their efforts, the nervous but genuine attempts to listen and respond with care. When the session ended, Claire approached him. "Mr. Hayes," she said, a little breathless. "I just wanted to thank you. We've heard about what you've been doing. It's making a difference." Elliot smiled warmly. The thanks belongs to those willing to carry it forward. Outside, as he walked through the campus, he reflected on how change often began quietly, almost invisibly. A word, a conversation, a shift in attitude. That evening, back at his apartment, Elliot received a letter, an actual handwritten letter, a rarity in his modern, fast-paced world. It was from a young man named Javier Mendoza, one of the new hires he had seen at the training session. In careful, earnest handwriting, Javier thanked Elliot for championing the changes at Atlas Air. He shared how he had grown up in a neighborhood where opportunities were scarce and how he had once felt invisible in spaces of power and privilege. Joining Atlas Air, he wrote, had been daunting, but the new culture made him feel seen, valued, respected. Elliot sat for a long time after reading the letter, the city lights flickering beyond his window. He thought about all the unseen battles people fought every day. How a single gesture of respect could tip the scales between despair and hope. He penned a reply to Javier, thanking him for his courage and assuring him that real leadership was not about titles, but about how one treated others. It was a simple note, but Elliot knew its weight. In the weeks that followed, Elliot continued to weave dignity into every aspect of his work. He championed new initiatives for frontline staff recognition, ensuring that employees who exemplified empathy and excellence were celebrated. He pushed for community outreach programs that invited feedback from diverse passenger groups. He also began mentoring a small group of young professionals within Atlas Air, sharing not just business strategies, but lessons on character, resilience, and the quiet power of integrity. One afternoon, as he prepared for a quarterly review meeting, Elliot received a call from Charles Whitman. "Elliot," Charles said, "we've just received a report from the Customer Advocacy Office. Passenger satisfaction scores have risen dramatically. Complaints about frontline interactions are down by nearly 40%. Whatever we're doing, it's working." Elliot allowed himself a rare moment of pride. Not for personal acclaim, but for the tangible proof that dignity, once seeded, could indeed flourish. At the quarterly review, he presented the findings with calm confidence. He showed not only the improvements in customer satisfaction, but also a correlation to increased brand loyalty and revenue growth. Treating people well, it turned out, was not just the right thing to do. It was good business. As he concluded his presentation, Elliot looked around the boardroom. He saw in the faces of his colleagues a growing understanding, a new awareness. It had not come through slogans or mandates alone. It had come through persistence, authenticity, and the undeniable truth that when you honor people's humanity, they respond in kind. After the meeting, Charles clapped a hand on Elliot's shoulder. "You've changed this company," he said simply. "We've changed it," Elliot corrected, knowing full well that real change was never the work of one person alone. That night, Elliot walked through Central Park, the humid air thick with the scents of summer, fresh grass, hot pretzels, the faint sweetness of blooming linden trees. Children laughed near the playground, couples strolled hand in hand, joggers passed by, earbuds in, lost in their rhythms. Elliot found a bench and sat, watching the dance of life around him. He thought about journeys, how they rarely followed straight lines, how they wound through moments of doubt, resistance, and small, stubborn victories. He thought about that morning at JFK, the sting of being underestimated, the choice to respond not with anger, but with purpose. And he thought about the thousands of passengers who would now move through Atlas Air's terminals, feeling a little more respected, a little more seen. Elliot Hayes smiled into the warm evening, a man content not with accolades, but with the quiet, enduring impact of a mission fulfilled and still unfolding. Summer faded into early autumn, and with the change of seasons, Elliot Hayes found himself reflecting more deeply on the legacy he hoped to leave behind. Atlas Air was thriving, not only in its financial performance, but also in its cultural renewal. The initiatives he had championed were no longer seen as new experiments, but as core parts of the company's identity. Yet Elliot knew that true leadership demanded more than success within one's own walls. Real change extended outward. It influenced the broader industry, set examples for competitors, and raised the standard for what was considered acceptable, even necessary. It was with that larger vision in mind that Elliot accepted an invitation to speak at the National Aviation Leadership Conference, a gathering of executives, regulators, advocates, and industry veterans from across the country. The conference offered a platform to share not only Atlas Air's journey, but a broader call to action. The event was held in Washington, D.C., in a grand hotel near the National Mall. The historic setting imbued the proceedings with a sense of gravity, a reminder that progress often walked hand in hand with tradition. On the morning of his speech, Elliot reviewed his notes one final time. He had carefully crafted his message to balance celebration and challenge, success and responsibility. When he took the stage, the room fell silent. He stood before hundreds of leaders, faces both familiar and new, and began not with charts or statistics, but with a story. He told them about a morning at JFK Airport, about being stopped without cause, about the silent judgments made without words, about the sting that lingered long after the encounter ended. But he did not speak with bitterness. Instead, he framed the experience as a catalyst, a moment that forced a deeper reckoning with the hidden biases that still lurked within even the most polished institutions. He spoke of Atlas Air's journey, the hard conversations, the revised policies, the investment in training and advocacy. He shared data, yes, improved satisfaction scores, increased employee engagement, but he emphasized the human stories behind the numbers. Stories of passengers feeling heard, employees feeling empowered, communities feeling respected. Excellence, Elliot said, his voice clear and firm, is not achieved when we treat our best customers well. It is achieved when we treat every customer with dignity, regardless of their appearance, their background, or their perceived importance. The applause was warm, genuine, But more importantly, as Elliot looked out across the room, he saw thoughtful expressions. He saw minds turning, questions forming. After the speech, several executives approached him, eager to learn more about Atlas Air's initiatives. Some asked practical questions about implementation. Others shared their own struggles to foster inclusive cultures. One young executive, a woman from a regional airline, said simply, "You made me see things differently today. Thank you." Elliot shook her hand warmly. "That's how change begins," he said. With seeing. The conference lasted 2 more days, filled with panels and workshops. Elliot participated actively, offering insights where he could, listening intently to others. He understood that leadership was as much about learning as it was about teaching. On the final evening, there was a reception at a rooftop venue overlooking the capital. The city lights twinkled against the night sky, and a cool breeze hinted at the coming fall. Elliot found a quiet corner, sipping a glass of sparkling water, reflecting on the journey so far. It had started with a simple boarding pass, a routine trip, an unexpected slight. And it had unfolded into something far greater, a mission to restore humanity to places where it had been worn thin by routine, stress, and unconscious prejudice. As he stood there, watching the city pulse with life, Elliot felt a deep, steady sense of fulfillment. Not because he had solved every problem, not because bias had been eradicated from the world, but because he had chosen to act, to speak, to believe that small, persistent efforts could add up to real, lasting change. One conversation at a time, one policy at a time, one moment of dignity at a time. When he returned to New York, Elliot threw himself back into his work with renewed energy. He continued mentoring young leaders, encouraging them to lead with empathy and courage. He worked with Atlas Air's partners to extend the company's principles outward, influencing supply chains and service providers. He also began writing not just memos and reports, but essays, reflections, calls to action. He published them in industry journals, offering a roadmap for building cultures rooted in respect and inclusion. His words resonated far beyond the aviation world. They were picked up by business magazines, leadership blogs, even university courses on organizational development. One autumn afternoon, as golden leaves danced along the sidewalks outside his office, Elliot received an invitation from a prestigious business school to deliver a guest lecture on leadership and ethics. He accepted, seeing it as another opportunity to plant seeds. Standing before a classroom of bright, idealistic students weeks later, Elliot shared the same core message that had guided him since that morning at JFK. The measure of a person and the measure of a company is not how they treat those they expect to benefit from. It is how they treat those they have no immediate reason to impress. He saw the students lean in, take notes, absorb the lesson. And he knew, once again, that the journey was far from over. But it was a journey worth taking, and he would walk it, step by deliberate step, for as long as he had the strength to do so. The crispness of autumn deepened, bringing with it a renewed sense of urgency for Elliot Hayes. The changes within Atlas Air had taken firm root, but Elliot understood that if the broader industry were to evolve, it would require more than one company's quiet transformation. It would require a wave of conversation, a shift in how leadership itself was envisioned. That was why Elliot decided to write. It started with a simple essay, a reflection on dignity, leadership, and unseen biases, published in a respected business journal. He wrote candidly, without grandstanding, sharing how a single morning at an airport had peeled back layers of assumptions he thought he had outgrown. He wrote about how easy it was, even for good people in good companies, to fall short when they lost sight of the humanity in each individual. The essay struck a nerve. Within weeks, it had been shared across social media, cited in industry newsletters, discussed in leadership workshops. Emails poured in from executives, HR directors, frontline employees, even university professors. Many thanked him for voicing something they had seen but struggled to name. Others shared their own stories of invisible struggles, of moments where a gesture of respect or disrespect had shaped their entire experience. Elliot responded to as many as he could. Each reply was deliberate, personal. He wanted people to know they were heard. Encouraged by the response, Elliot continued writing. He crafted a series of essays, each exploring a different facet of leadership: the moral weight of everyday decisions, the quiet courage of admitting mistakes, the power of listening without judgment. Major business magazines picked up his work. Leadership blogs reprinted excerpts. His name began to circulate not just as an airline executive, but as a voice for a deeper, more human approach to leadership. At first, Elliot was cautious. He had no interest in fame or in becoming a thought leader detached from the realities of business life. But he saw an opportunity, a responsibility even, to use the platform he had been given to encourage others to see differently. One essay titled "The Leadership You Show When No One Is Watching" became particularly influential. In it, Elliot argued that the true measure of an organization wasn't in its glossy marketing campaigns or public pledges, but in the way its least visible employees treated the least powerful customers on an ordinary day. That essay was cited by Fortune 500 CEOs, non-profit leaders, and even military academies. It was translated into multiple languages and incorporated into corporate training programs around the world. Through it all, Elliot remained grounded. He still came to the Atlas Air offices most days, mentoring young employees, sitting in on training sessions, reviewing customer feedback reports. He knew that essays and speeches could inspire, but real change was built day by day, conversation by conversation. At an industry roundtable hosted in Chicago, Elliot was invited to discuss the role of leadership in shaping corporate culture. Seated around the table were executives from some of the largest companies in America. When it was his turn to speak, Elliot shared a simple principle. Culture is not a mission statement on a wall. It is the worst behavior we are willing to tolerate. There was a long silence as the weight of his words settled over the room. Several executives nodded. A few scribbled notes. One leaned back, arms crossed, thoughtful. Afterward, a senior leader from a major hotel chain approached him privately. "Your words hit home," she said. "We've been struggling with these exact issues, but it's easy to get distracted by short-term targets." "Short-term wins are important," Elliot replied gently. "But if we lose our people's trust, we lose everything." That conversation, like so many others, became another ripple in the widening current Elliot had helped to start. He never set out to be a public figure. He had no desire for awards or accolades, but in choosing to tell his story, honestly, vulnerably, he had given permission for others to do the same. He had shown that leadership was not about perfection. It was about humility, about the willingness to see what was broken and to work, patiently, persistently, to repair it. And as autumn gave way to winter, Elliot Hayes continued his quiet revolution, one essay, one conversation, one act of courage at a time. Winter came with its sharp winds and silver skies, but within Atlas Air, there was a warmth that had taken root, a culture of respect, resilience, and human connection that could be felt in every terminal, every cabin, every conversation. Elliot Hayes watched this evolution quietly, with the satisfaction of a craftsman who sees a once fragile creation stand strong against the elements. Recognition soon followed. Atlas Air began receiving awards for excellence in customer service, diversity and inclusion, and corporate responsibility. Prestigious magazines featured the company in their annual rankings. Passengers posted heartfelt testimonials online, sharing stories of small kindnesses that had transformed stressful journeys into moments of grace. At an industry gala in New York, Atlas Air was honored with the Customer Experience Company of the Year award. Charles Whitman, the CEO, accepted the trophy on behalf of the company, but made a point of thanking Elliot personally from the stage. This journey began because one man chose not to be silent, Charles said, his voice carrying across the grand ballroom. Because one man believed that dignity was not a luxury, but a necessity. The audience rose in a standing ovation. Cameras flashed. Applause echoed against the marble walls. Elliot, seated at a quiet table near the back, acknowledged the tribute with a modest nod. He appreciated the recognition, but he had never done any of this for applause. After the ceremony, younger executives and employees approached him, eager to shake his hand, to thank him for his example. Some shared personal stories of moments when they had chosen empathy over expediency, inspired by the culture he had helped build. Elliot listened to each story with genuine attention, offering encouragement and simple advice. Stay steady. Small actions, repeated over time, change everything. Yet even amidst the celebration, Elliot remained vigilant. He knew that culture could not be set once and forgotten. It had to be nurtured continually, guarded against complacency. He understood that success often carried the seeds of its own undoing, that when people grew too comfortable, they risked losing the urgency that had driven their transformation. Back at headquarters, Elliot convened a series of roundtable discussions with employees at all levels: pilots, flight attendants, gate agents, customer service representatives. He wanted to hear directly from those who lived the company's values every day. He asked hard questions. Where were they still falling short? Where did passengers feel unseen? Where did employees feel unsupported? The conversations were honest, sometimes uncomfortable. But Elliot welcomed the discomfort. It meant people cared enough to tell the truth. One evening, after a particularly candid session with a group of ground crew employees, Elliot stayed behind, chatting informally. A young man named Malik, who worked baggage handling, shared a story about a passenger whose luggage had been lost on a critical trip. Malik had personally taken ownership of the situation, driving across town after his shift to deliver the bag to the passenger's hotel. "I just thought," Malik said, shrugging, "if it was my mom or my brother, I'd want someone to care enough to fix it." Elliot smiled, feeling a surge of pride. "That's leadership," he said. "Right there." Moments like that reminded Elliot why the work mattered, why it was never really done. In the months that followed, Atlas Air launched new initiatives: scholarships for underrepresented communities, mentorship programs for junior staff, partnerships with non-profits focused on traveler advocacy. The company's success was measured not just in profit margins, but in loyalty, in reputation, in the quiet strength of a workforce that believed in its mission. Through it all, Elliot remained a steady presence. Not seeking headlines, not chasing accolades, but moving among his colleagues with humility and purpose. He often thought back to that morning at JFK, to the sting of being judged by appearances. That wound had become a wellspring of strength, a reminder that dignity, once denied, could fuel a lifelong commitment to ensuring it was never denied to others. One snowy evening, as Elliot left the office, he paused to watch a group of employees decorating the lobby for the holidays. Laughter filled the air. Someone hung a banner that read, "Every journey matters. Every person matters." Elliot smiled to himself. Not a slogan, not anymore. A reality. And as he stepped into the swirling snow, he carried with him the quiet joy of a man who had helped to build something enduring, something good. One choice, one conversation, one act of respect at a time. As the new year unfolded, Elliot Hayes knew that the real test of any cultural change was not in moments of celebration, but in how an organization responded to setbacks. Progress was rarely linear. It ebbed and flowed, tested by human nature and the daily pressures of business. One chilly February morning, a report crossed Elliot's desk that gave him pause. It detailed an incident at a smaller regional airport serviced by Atlas Air. A passenger, a young mother traveling with her toddler, had been treated dismissively by a gate agent during a delayed boarding process. Her concerns were brushed aside. She was spoken to curtly, made to feel like an inconvenience rather than a valued customer. The woman had filed a complaint through the newly established Customer Advocacy Office. Her account was measured and respectful, but the hurt was clear between the lines. Reading it, Elliot felt a familiar tightening in his chest. Not anger, not yet, but a deep concern. A single incident, if left unaddressed, could unravel months of progress. It could signal to employees that the company's values were negotiable, conditional. Elliot scheduled a meeting with the regional manager responsible for the airport. Sitting across the conference table, he listened carefully as the manager explained. Staffing shortages, weather delays, high stress levels. Elliot nodded, understanding the pressures. But then he leaned forward, his voice quiet but firm. We cannot control the weather. We cannot control staffing challenges overnight, but we can control how we treat people, especially when circumstances are difficult. That is when our values matter most. The regional manager swallowed hard and nodded. Together, they developed an action plan, immediate retraining for the gate staff involved, a follow-up call to the affected passenger with a personal apology, and a broader review of customer service protocols at all regional outposts. Elliot insisted on one additional step. He would visit the airport himself. It was a modest facility, serving mostly short-haul flights. The staff were young, many still early in their careers. When Elliot arrived, there was a ripple of curiosity. Few expected a senior executive to make the trip, let alone spend a day shadowing operations. Elliot moved through the terminal observing interactions, speaking quietly with employees between flights. He made no speeches, issued no reprimands. Instead, he asked simple questions. What's the hardest part of your day? What would make it easier to serve passengers better? He listened. He heard about outdated equipment, about confusing protocols, about moments when employees felt unsupported in dealing with frustrated travelers. He also heard about pride in working for a company that was trying to do things differently, pride in being part of a culture that valued people, even if living up to that standard wasn't always easy. Before he left, Elliot gathered the staff for an impromptu meeting. Standing in the modest break room, holding a cup of vending machine coffee, he spoke from the heart. We all have tough days, he said. Days when the pressures make it tempting to cut corners, to lose patience. But those are the days that define us. Those are the days when a kind word, a listening ear, a little extra effort can change someone's entire experience. He paused, letting the words settle. We're not just moving luggage or checking boarding passes. We're shaping how people feel about themselves, about travel, about trust. The employees listened intently. Some nodded. A few smiled. Elliot left them with a simple challenge. Be the person who makes a bad day better, not worse. On his flight back to New York, Elliot reflected on the visit. The setback had been real, but so had the opportunity it revealed. Systems needed constant tending. Values needed to be lived, not just stated. In the following weeks, Atlas Air rolled out additional support programs for frontline employees, better training, clearer escalation channels, wellness resources to manage stress. The young mother, who had filed the complaint, received a personal letter of apology along with a voucher for future travel. She responded with gratitude, noting that she felt heard, valued. It wasn't perfect. It wouldn't erase the initial hurt. But it mattered. Elliot knew that true culture change was not about eliminating every mistake. It was about how you responded when mistakes happened. About humility, about recommitting again and again to the hard work of respect. And so, as February gave way to March, Elliot Hayes pressed forward, steady as ever. Not chasing perfection, but nurturing persistence, knowing that real leadership was not proven in easy seasons, but in the cold, challenging ones when the true strength of your principles was tested. Spring arrived with a sense of renewal, and with it came new opportunities for Elliot Hayes to extend his influence beyond the walls of Atlas Air. The company had become a beacon within the industry, an example of how corporate culture could evolve without losing sight of its business goals. But Elliot was never content to let good work stay confined within one organization. He received an invitation to lead a special leadership seminar series for executives across various industries, not just aviation, but finance, healthcare, technology, and education. The program, titled Leading with Integrity, would focus on practical strategies for building cultures rooted in respect, empathy, and accountability. At first, Elliot hesitated. His natural inclination was to work quietly behind the scenes. But he realized that sharing the lessons he had learned, the mistakes as well as the successes, could help others navigate their own journeys. The seminars were held at a historic university campus, a place where towering oaks shaded winding paths and stone buildings whispered of generations past. Each session drew a small, diverse group of senior leaders who came not for show, but for substance. Elliot began every seminar the same way, not with a speech, but with a question. Think of a time, he would say, when someone treated you with dignity at a moment when you felt vulnerable. How did it change the way you saw yourself? The answers varied. A teacher who believed in them, a manager who listened, a stranger who showed unexpected kindness. But the common thread was clear. Dignity had a lasting, transformative power. From there, Elliot guided the discussions toward practical realities. He challenged the executives to examine their hiring practices, their promotion criteria, their disciplinary procedures. Were they reinforcing a culture of fairness or unintentionally rewarding expediency and favoritism? He emphasized that policies mattered, but behavior mattered more. Culture, he said, is built in the moments no one writes down. In how you react when you're tired, when you're under pressure, when no one would blame you for cutting a corner. The sessions were intense, emotional even. Some participants shared painful stories of realizing they had failed to protect their teams from toxic behavior. Others spoke of their fears, that slowing down to prioritize empathy would cost them competitive advantage. Elliot listened patiently, offering no judgment, only clarity. "Empathy isn't about weakness," he said. "It's about seeing reality more fully. And the clearer you see reality, the better decisions you make." Word of the seminars spread. Demand grew. Elliot was asked to speak at conferences, to consult privately with companies grappling with cultural challenges. He accepted some invitations, declined others, careful not to dilute the integrity of his message. Meanwhile, at Atlas Air, the culture he had nurtured continued to flourish. Customer satisfaction remained high. Employee turnover dropped. Perhaps most gratifying of all, internal surveys showed a rising sense of pride among staff, not just in what they did, but in how they did it. One afternoon, after concluding a seminar session, Elliot sat on a bench overlooking a quiet courtyard. He thought about how far the journey had taken him. From that morning at JFK, when a moment of silent judgment had ignited a resolve he hadn't even known he possessed. He reflected on a truth that had crystallized over the years. Leadership was not about control. It was about influence. About the invisible threads of trust, respect, and courage that wove people together in pursuit of something larger than themselves. As he sat there, a young woman who had attended the seminar approached. She was the CEO of a fast-growing tech company, known for its innovation, but struggling with internal fractures. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "I just wanted to thank you. You've given me a new way to think about leadership. It's not just about driving results. It's about protecting the spirit of the people who create those results." Elliot smiled warmly. "Protect the spirit," he repeated. "That's a good way to put it." They talked for a few minutes more before she hurried off to catch her flight. Elliot remained on the bench a while longer, the afternoon sun dappling the stones at his feet. He knew there was still much work to do. That biases would persist, that moments of failure would still arise. But he also knew that seeds had been planted in boardrooms, in break rooms, in quiet moments of self-reflection. And that was how real change happened, not overnight, not in grand gestures, but in steady, unseen ways, like roots growing deeper beneath the surface, ready to sustain new life for generations to come. As Elliot gathered his things and made his way across the campus, he felt the familiar, steady pull of purpose. The journey continued. And he would walk it, with humility, with resilience, with an unwavering belief that dignity, once honored, could reshape the world. As spring matured into summer, the changes that Elliot Hayes had helped spark at Atlas Air blossomed fully. The company was no longer just recognized within the industry. It had become a national symbol of what compassionate leadership could achieve. Major publications featured in-depth profiles on Atlas Air's journey. Academic institutions studied its model, and awards for excellence in customer service and employee engagement continued to pour in. Passengers noticed the difference immediately. Stories circulated widely about gate agents who went out of their way to assist stranded travelers, about flight attendants who offered not just service, but sincere empathy during difficult flights, about managers who treated their teams with respect and dignity even under pressure. Atlas Air had become the gold standard. Competitors began adjusting their own training programs, re-evaluating internal policies, trying to catch up to the cultural transformation that had made Atlas not just a leader in revenue, but a leader in spirit. Yet amid all the acclaim, Elliot remained steadfastly humble. He continued to arrive at the office quietly each morning, his routines unchanged. He still met with frontline employees regularly, listening to their concerns and insights. He still insisted on reviewing customer feedback reports personally, searching for patterns, for signs of drift, for opportunities to improve. One afternoon, during a meeting with the leadership team, Charles Whitman, the CEO, addressed the group. "We've achieved extraordinary things," Charles said, "but we have to remember, the culture we've built is not a trophy we display. It's a garden we tend every day." Elliot smiled at that. It was the exact metaphor he had often used in quieter conversations. After the meeting, a young marketing executive approached Elliot. "Mr. Hayes," she said, a little hesitantly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course," Elliot replied. "How do we make sure we don't lose what we've built?" Elliot considered the question carefully before answering. "By remembering that every person matters," he said, "not just our best customers, not just our highest performers. Everyone. When you protect that principle in every decision, every policy, every conversation, you protect the culture." The young woman nodded thoughtfully, jotting down a few notes. Later that week, Elliot traveled to a remote maintenance facility, a part of the company few executives ever visited. He spent the day with technicians, mechanics, and support staff, hearing their stories, observing their pride in work that often went unseen but was critical to passenger safety and comfort. At the end of his visit, he gathered the team together. "People often celebrate what they can see," he told them. "But real excellence, the kind that lasts, depends on what happens behind the scenes when no one is watching. Your work, your integrity, is the foundation of everything we do." The technicians, hardened professionals unaccustomed to corporate speeches, applauded warmly. Driving back to the city that evening, Elliot reflected on the invisible threads that now wove Atlas Air together: trust, respect, shared purpose. He knew they were fragile, that they had to be reinforced daily, not just with policies, but with living examples, and he knew that leadership was not about being celebrated. It was about serving, quietly, persistently, faithfully. As the summer sun dipped below the skyline, casting long shadows across the highway, Elliot felt a deep, steady contentment. The work was never done. But it was good work. And it was work worth giving his best to, for as long as he could. The first hints of autumn returned, painting the city in soft golds and muted reds. Elliot Hayes found himself walking more often these days, taking slow, deliberate steps through Central Park as the leaves crunched gently underfoot. It was in these quiet walks that Elliot allowed himself to reflect, not just on recent successes, but on the journey that had brought him to this point. He remembered vividly that morning at JFK, the sting of being judged unfairly, the small but potent humiliation of being questioned when he had done nothing wrong. What could have remained a bitter memory had instead become a catalyst for transformation, not only for himself, but for an entire company and beyond. It amazed him how a single moment, seemingly small in the grand arc of a life, could shift the course of so much more. He thought about the hundreds of employees at Atlas Air who now carried themselves with renewed pride. About the countless passengers whose experiences were shaped by a company that had chosen to place human dignity at the center of its operations. He thought about the young leaders he had mentored, men and women, now carrying the torch forward in their own organizations, embedding respect and empathy into business practices that had once valued only speed and profit. Elliot understood now that real change was like water wearing down stone, imperceptible day by day, but unstoppable over time. It wasn't achieved through grand declarations or overnight reforms, but through persistence, through the choice, again and again, to act differently. He also understood that change required more than just action. It required belief, a deep-seated conviction that every person mattered, even when acknowledging that truth was inconvenient, even when it demanded more patience, more effort. Sitting on a weathered bench near the park's great lawn, Elliot pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket. He had developed the habit of jotting down thoughts as they came to him. Lessons learned, ideas yet to explore, reminders of what truly mattered. On this day, he wrote just one line. "The world does not change all at once. It changes one act of dignity at a time." He smiled faintly as he closed the notebook. Later that week, Elliot spoke at a quiet ceremony where Atlas Air was recognized for its contributions to industry ethics. As he accepted the plaque, a simple, understated piece of polished wood and brass, he reflected not on the award itself, but on the countless unseen moments that had led there. A gate agent choosing to listen rather than dismiss. A manager taking the time to mentor an employee instead of reprimanding them. A team choosing transparency over expediency. Each choice, seemingly small in isolation, had accumulated into something powerful, something real. After the ceremony, a reporter asked Elliot what advice he would give to leaders hoping to replicate Atlas Air's success. Elliot thought for a moment, then answered simply, "Begin with how you treat the person standing right in front of you." The reporter seemed surprised by the simplicity of the answer, but Elliot knew it was the only truth that mattered. As the days grew shorter and the city prepared for winter, Elliot spent more time mentoring quietly, visiting Atlas Air offices and facilities without fanfare. He made a point of stopping by places that were often overlooked: maintenance hangars, call centers, regional offices. Everywhere he went, he looked not for perfection, but for effort, for the quiet, steady signs that the culture he had helped seed was still growing. And he found them, in the way employees spoke to one another, in the stories passengers shared, in the way challenges were met with collaboration rather than blame. One evening, as he prepared to leave a maintenance facility after a long day, a young technician approached him. "Mr. Hayes," he said, a little shyly, "I just wanted to say, it's different here now." "Better. We feel it. We live it." Elliot shook his hand warmly. "That's the real reward," he said. "Not the awards or the headlines. It's knowing that together we've made something that matters." Driving home that night, Elliot felt a profound sense of peace. He knew there would still be setbacks ahead, that no culture stayed healthy without continued effort. But he also knew that the foundation was strong. And he knew, most of all, that what had begun as a painful, isolated experience had been transformed into something far greater, a testament to the power of patience, integrity, and the unwavering belief in human dignity. As he pulled into his driveway, the first snowflakes of the season began to fall, dusting the city in quiet white. Elliot watched them for a long moment, feeling the deep, steady current of gratitude running through him. The journey was not over, but it had been, and continued to be, a journey worth every step. Winter deepened, laying a quiet hush over the city. In the warm glow of his office, Elliot Hayes prepared for a moment he had known was coming, his farewell to Atlas Air. After decades of building, nurturing, and guiding, He had decided it was time to step down and make space for a new generation of leaders to continue the journey. The decision had not been made lightly. Elliot loved his work. He loved the people he worked with, but he understood that true leadership included knowing when to let go, when to trust that the seeds you planted would continue to grow without you standing over them. His last day approached with little fanfare, just the way he preferred it. No grand speeches, no extravagant farewell parties. Instead, he spent his final weeks visiting every corner of the company, shaking hands, offering quiet words of encouragement, sharing coffee with colleagues old and new. In every office, every terminal, every hangar, he saw reflections of the values he had championed: dignity, patience, respect. On his final morning, he stood before a modest gathering of employees at headquarters. Charles Whitman spoke briefly, his voice thick with emotion, honoring Elliot not just for his professional achievements, but for the culture of humanity he had built. Then it was Elliot's turn. He stepped forward, no notes in hand, speaking simply from the heart. "When I first began this journey," he said, "I thought leadership was about vision, strategy, execution. And it is. But over time, I learned that leadership is most of all about people, about how you make them feel, about whether you leave them stronger than you found them." He paused, letting the quiet settle. The world will always have storms, industries will change, challenges will arise. But the strength of a company, the strength of a community, lies in how steadfastly it honors the dignity of every person it touches. There were no grand declarations, no sweeping promises, just the quiet, enduring truth he had lived by. After the gathering, Elliot walked through the building one last time. He stopped by the customer service desk where he had often lingered to hear stories. He peeked into the training rooms where new employees learned not just procedures, but principles. He visited the maintenance bays where the heartbeat of the company pulsed steadily. Everywhere he went, he saw life moving forward, not clinging to the past, but carrying it forward. Outside, a light snow had begun to fall, dusting the streets in a soft white blanket. Elliot pulled his coat tighter around him and walked slowly toward the subway station, eschewing the black car that had been offered to him. He wanted to leave the same way he had always tried to lead, unassuming, grounded, connected to the real world. On the platform, a young Atlas Air employee recognized him. "Mr. Hayes," she said, approaching shyly, "I just wanted to say thank you. I started here because of what I heard about the culture you built. It's real. It matters." Elliot smiled warmly. "Thank you," he said. "But remember, it's yours now. Protect it. Grow it." As the train pulled into the station, Elliot boarded and found a seat by the window. The city blurred past, 1,000 lives unfolding, 1,000 journeys beginning and ending. He thought again of that moment so many years ago, standing at Gate 17 in JFK Airport, facing suspicion without cause. He thought about how easy it would have been to let bitterness harden him, to let frustration define him. Instead, he had chosen a different path. The harder path, the quieter path, the path of persistence and hope, and it had made all the difference. As the train carried him forward, Elliot Hayes sat with a quiet, steady peace in his chest. The journey was never really about him. It was about the belief that a single act of dignity could ripple outward, touching lives he would never know, shaping futures he would never see. And in that belief, he had built something enduring, something that would outlast him, something that mattered. In a world that often moves too fast, Elliot Hayes's journey reminds us of a timeless truth. Dignity is never outdated. Every small choice we make, to listen with patience, to treat others with respect, even when no one is watching, builds the kind of legacy that outlasts titles, awards, or fleeting success. True leadership is not measured in profits or praise, but in the quiet moments when we choose to uplift someone who feels unseen. Elliot's story teaches us that real change doesn't come from grand gestures. It grows slowly through persistence, humility, and an unwavering belief in human worth. As we move through our own seasons of life, especially in later years when wisdom runs deep, we are reminded that the greatest gift we can offer is not our achievements, but the kindness and courage we show each day. One act of dignity, one moment of empathy, can ripple further than we will ever know. And sometimes, that's how the world is changed.